Welcome everyone to Chapter 10, which is our course summary. Now in this chapter, we are going to recap everything that we have learned over the last 8 chapters, and we're going to tie it back to the learning objectives that we set out to accomplish all the way back in Chapter 1. And as a reminder of what those learning outcomes are, we wanted to understand the current state of AI adoption and what it means for you and your role. We wanted to understand foundational AI concepts and understand them in clear, practical language. We wanted to be hands-on with real business scenarios, and we wanted to build our finance AI muscle. Now in Chapter 2, we looked at a very brief history of AI. And we covered topics such as looking at how far automation has come in the past 20 years, from earlier rule-based automation to machine learning and now to large language models. We reviewed some of the key breakthroughs such as transformer architecture, and now that we have cheaper cloud compute supporting faster close cycles, better risk reduction and decision support through the use of AI technology within finance and treasury. Then we looked at reasons why we're seeing this accelerated growth now in AI and its adoption today. And after that, we reviewed some of the reasons around the hype with AI and brought it back to reality and how we're using AI today. Then in Chapter 3, we turned our attention to AI terminology. We really focused on core concepts within AI, such as the fact that AI learns from patterns and not by memorizing rules. And it does this by predicting what comes next and is heavily influenced by the business context that we provide the model. We looked at the distinction between deterministic and non-deterministic models and the difference between the two. We know that we need both types of models within finance. Deterministic models are things like your traditional ERP software, whereas your non-deterministic systems are things like your large language models. Then we looked at, what generative AI is, and that ultimately it's about creating new content by predicting what comes next based upon patterns it's learned from large amounts of data, hence the name large language models. Then we turned our attention to Agentic AI and the fact that it can take action, not just answer questions. And then we covered other terminology that you might hear when working with AI, such as HITL, or human in the loop. We talked about prompts, hallucinations, tokens, and what each of those mean in the context of working with AI. Then in Chapter 4, we turned our attention to prompt engineering, and we covered topics such as why prompt phrasing matters and that prompt quality is far more important than prompt length. If you remember, we learned about the roles framework and how it can be used to structure your prompts for consistency. Do you remember what roles stands for? Remember I told you how easy it is to remember because the first letter is the word. It's role. Then you need your objective. You need your limits. You need to set expectations and you need to set the style for the response that you need. So don't forget that. We then reviewed a number of common mistakes to avoid when prompting these large language models. Then we looked at some very practical use cases and prompts that you can use right now. And as a reminder, you'll have access to the document with these prompts that you can copy and paste or tweak and use them in the future within your LLM of choice. We then covered a hands-on exercise to really just enforce that understanding of how to leverage the roles framework to produce better outcomes when you're working with these models. Now, Chapter 5, things got really exciting as we jumped into using generative AI and really focused on some practical use cases. We kicked off by looking at research use cases and leveraging ChatGPT's deep research functionality. Then we turned our attention to ideation and content creation, but we really focused on the use of that within finance and treasury by focusing on variance analysis that's derived from the underlying data that we gave the model through a simple upload. Then we looked at how we can actually generate code from a large language model. And we actually created our own custom Python script without any underlying knowledge or expertise in Python coding. And then we wrapped up chapter 5 by looking at the creation of our own custom GPT. And we created one that was going to be used to support our HR policy and benefits interpretation. It's a great use case for creating your own custom GPT and knowledge center. In chapter 6, we took it one step further and focused on agentic AI practical use cases. This is where the model can make its own decisions and break out tasks. And we started by looking at a cash flow variance system. What we did was we broke down the human process and we split it into steps that we can automate, where we can leverage the agent to perform those steps, versus those that require judgment, where we want that human in the loop. Then we turned our attention to a cash flow forecasting system, and we applied that same concept to this forecasting process. Treasury analysts can lean on an agent like this to update their forecast and then focus their time on challenging the assumptions that have been used to generate the output. So you spend more time on the analysis and digging in versus manually updating the forecast. Then we looked at a very practical use case in building a bank reconciliation system. And we called out that this is especially effective for companies that are not yet managing this process within their ERP or their TMS. If they're managing it within spreadsheets today, or even to some extent in an ERP or TMS, they can get real value out of a bank reconciliation system. And then we looked at some additional use cases to consider when leaning on ChatGPT's agent mode. So make sure you check those out. In chapter 7, we started to talk about our build versus buy decision making when it comes to AI applications. We looked at when we should build and acknowledge that even when we have the internal expertise, that we may not always have the capacity to support internal projects with those expertise, because typically the folks with those expertise are going to be put on customer-facing projects and product development. We looked at when to buy, and we confirmed that it makes a lot of sense to buy when we're working with vendors that have a strong specialization and ideally pre-built integrations. The combination of those is going to accelerate the time to value when embarking on this AI journey. We also talked about the importance of connectivity, and we spent some time discussing the benefits of having real-time integrations versus a manual upload versus, say, an SFTP integration, and the benefit of those direct API integrations. Then with all of this information, we looked at how do we decide, how do we make the decision between building an AI application versus buying one. And we actually reviewed a checklist in terms of questions we can ask ourselves to get to the right decision. And don't forget that that checklist is available for you to download once you've completed the course. In chapter 8, we started to look at how we can, promote internal adoption of AI and experimentation of AI. We looked at establishing that culture of experimentation by really, creating a safe space where our team can fail, but we frame it as an opportunity to learn with AI and grow with it. We talked about some practical things that we can do through an AI hackathon and pilots, and using those as a means to drive adoption. We talked about the role of AI champions and that they're important for driving adoption through peer groups. And they don't need to be technical champions. They don't need to understand, the coding behind large language models. But what they do is actually help translate the AI technology into day-to-day workflows that people understand, that they have had success with, and that they can share their learnings and their journey to help promote adoption more broadly across the company. We also talked about your role as a change advocate for AI, and we emphasized the importance of enabling others and not just trying to build everything on your own. And then we wrapped up that chapter by looking at some practical resources so that you can get a fast start with your team when it comes to AI adoption. We looked at a number of different options, including an ideation tracker. We said, that our teams have a lot of ideas when it comes to AI, but they don't have a place to put it. So having a centralized tracker can be really beneficial. We talked about creating an AI success story interview template. Get your stories out there, share them more broadly where you have successes and where you have failures, because those are ultimately learnings on your journey to AI adoption. And then we closed out the chapter by looking at a 30-day AI starter plan that you can use today. And then finally, in chapter 9, we reviewed some of the other important considerations when working with AI. Now, throughout this entire course, we've talked about using AI responsibly. And we discussed the importance of, not just relying on the outputs that you receive from AI, but the need for human judgment to review those and reflect those. Don't just take them at face value. We then talked about data privacy and security, and really just understanding that the criticality of data privacy and security applies to AI just as it does elsewhere within our use of technology. We looked at, the idea of taking a tiered approach to the data that we provide our large language models and sharing that information to enable user adoption. So everyone knows, hey, should I be loading payroll data into our large language model versus, publicly available data that's out there, such as, an historical earnings report. And making that distinction very clear to your end users so they know what they can and cannot do, and within those boundaries, they can go ahead and experiment with AI. We talked about using AI as a supplemental analytical thinking tool. And after we turned our attention to leveraging AI as a force multiplier, we realized that that's the beauty of it. That's the benefit of leveraging AI. It's a force multiplier for our thinking. It is not a replacement of our thinking. And then we had some fun talking about what the future holds within AI. We looked at considerations for the next 12 to 24 months within treasury and finance and the use of AI technology, which I think most of that is expected to happen here very soon or is already on its way. And then we also had, a fun look at some bolder predictions in terms of what lies ahead in the future. And we'll see if any or all of that comes to pass. Now, in terms of this chapter, we really tied everything back to our learning objectives that we set out all the way back in chapter 1. You should now be able to confidently say that these learning objectives have been met. And if you're not quite there, that's okay. Use the content of this chapter to pinpoint the areas that you should go back and revisit and spend some more time with, because each chapter is tied to specific learning objectives. Congratulations, you have successfully completed chapter 10. And I do just want to take a second to thank you all for embarking on this AI journey with me. I hope it has inspired you to get started on your own journey. Please don't forget to download your course completion certificate. You have certainly earned it by completing this course. Thank you once again for joining me, and have a great day.